If you're anything like me, you're always hunting for stories that make your skin crawl in the best way. That's why I have to tell you about Grimly. Every week, they dig into the unholy, the unsolved, and the deeply unsettling. From chilling true crime to eerie tales that blur the line between fact and folklore. The production is hauntingly good, the storytelling absolutely captivating. It's the kind of podcast that stays with you long after you finish listening. So if you're ready to explore the darker side of history and humanity, subscribe to Grimly wherever you get your podcasts. Just don't say I didn't warn you.
Research and recording of Canadian Creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with.
Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Science fairs are a place where people first learn to ask questions like, what causes strange things to happen? Or, how do you measure something you can't see? Or even, what counts as real evidence? Normally at a high school science fair, you would probably see volcanoes made from baking soda and vinegar, or solar systems made out of foam balls, or even plant growth experiments like plants exposed to light versus dark, or music versus silence. But two grade 12 students from La Ronge, Saskatchewan decided to take a different approach with their science fair projects. In the autumn of 2021 and into the winter of 2022, the students named Alyssa and Shannon chose to study a paranormal event that had been happening in the area for decades. As far back as anyone can remember, the locals have reported seeing lights of a ghost train. The town of St. Louis, and no, I'm not talking about Missouri, was founded by the Métis settlers in the late 19th century and is the furthest point north of the South Branch settlement along the South Saskatchewan River. Between the 1860s and the 1890s, the Métis families were migrating westwards towards Manitoba, seeking to escape from the settler pressure, land displacement, and racism after the Red River Resistance. Following this, the community of St. Louis began to grow as more Franco-Catholic settlers and pioneers moved into the area, and as such, the town quickly evolved into a key transportation point across the South Saskatchewan River. In the early 1900s, the Canadian government wanted a second transcontinental railway to break the Canadian Pacific Railway and support Northern Prairie settlers. Because of this, the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway built a branch line north towards Prince Albert and reached St. Louis in late 1913. In later years, as highways began to improve transportation methods and local automobile traffic took over, people started to rely less and less on the railway. The GTP eventually was absorbed by the newly formed Canadian National Railway, which started using this rail line to transport grains up until 1983, when the line was officially abandoned. Since then, the steel tracks and wooden ties were pulled up and removed in 1988. All that remains of this site is flat grassy trails that run through private properties and farmlands. Today, the town is just a sleepy little hamlet, hometown of two NHL players. But It's also the home to several ghost stories, and their most famous are the lights from the Phantom Ghost Train. So popular, in fact, that on June 13th, 2014, Canada Post released a St. Louis ghost train stamp as part of their first multi-year Haunted Canada collection. Serge Garreau grew up in St. Louis, so the stories were already pretty familiar to him. He'd never seen the lights himself, but he knew where people went looking for them. A few years back, an Alberta couple came through Saskatchewan to visit, so Serge and his wife figured that they could give their friends something to talk about on the drive home. Nothing serious, just a late-night detour with a ghost train at the end of it. So they piled into Serge's vehicle and headed northeast. It's about 130 kilometers from Saskatoon to St. Louis, and they made the trip in just one clean shot. When they got there, it was around 11 p.m. The old rail line sits just north of town, and the track bend is still pretty easy to find. So they pulled up beside it, left the engine running for heat, and settled in for the wait. So a whole hour goes by with them just sitting there, and nothing happens. But then suddenly, a light shows up. It looked like a train coming down the line, a bright white beam, a red glow near the bottom. It held steady, like it was moving towards them, but it never closed the distance. They sat there watching this light for close to 2 hours, and eventually everyone in the car starts debating about whether they should drive towards it. And so they did, and the light stayed in view through the windshield as they eased through the rough road that runs alongside the old tracks. They drove straight towards it. The road kept going, and the light stayed ahead of them, until it didn't. One moment it was there, and the next, poof, gone. When they looked around, it was behind them. To this day, Serge still tells the story, and he always ends it with mentioning that at least one person in the car was terrified. For over a century now, people have been driving out to that stretch of countryside north of St. Louis. Sure, the tracks are gone, the crossing is gone, but the stories themselves didn't go anywhere. Most nights, you can find a few vehicles pulled off near the old right-of-way. Folks will sit in their cars with the engine running, watching the dark and waiting for the light that's supposed to show up. Some people describe it as a bright white beam that moves along the old line like a train headlight. Others will mention a smaller red glow that hangs low, sometimes drifting around the white one. But both of them show up often enough that everyone expects to see them both. There's a stretch of dirt road that runs beside the old track bed, and anyone who's been out there knows how to find it. You see the light from the main pull-off, and you can see it from the road, too. The strange part is how it behaves when you try to close the distance. Drivers will head straight towards it, thinking they're getting somewhere, and then the light just disappears, and just like Serge, it pops up somewhere behind them. Stories like this come from locals and visitors, and it's been that way for generations. In fact, the stories of this ghost light have been told for so long that some people aren't even sure how it even started. Perhaps one of the better-known stories comes from Emile Lucier, who also served as the mayor of St. Louis years ago. He and his brother-in-law decided to walk the old line one night. They went about a mile without seeing anything. Then, a solid white beam appeared behind them. It hit the ground right at their heels, throwing their shadows forward on the track. They spun around, and the light was gone. So they head back to town, and they told a few people what happened, and a small group followed them out to the crossing to see for themselves. Lucier stayed on the road while the others walked the trail. Before they got too far, a bright globe appeared over the track bed and lit them up, and then it vanished a moment later. Lucier called out, and none of the boys had actually seen it though. Now, Lucier's son Edward was also in that group, and he continues to talk about it years later. He said that the light came from behind them and lit the tracks and their silhouettes. Lucier came running towards them, thinking that they'd be scared, but they hadn't noticed anything at all. And like all good ghost stories, this one has a back legend. At the north end of Gastown in Vancouver, there's an old Pacific rail yard just beside the harbor. On certain nights, people say that a faint lantern-like glow moves across the tracks and cuts out without warning. A few SkyTrain employees from the nearby waterfront station have talked about seeing a figure on the railway in overalls from the 1920s walking the yard, his head missing, and a lantern in hand. The earliest printed material on that story comes from a book published in 1985 by Ted Ferguson. He collected railway stories from veterans he met during a cross-country trip, and one of them talked about a night in 1928 when a brakeman named Hub Clark slipped while pulling into the yard. He had apparently fallen from a freight car, hit his head on the rail, and was knocked out when a passenger train came through moments later and ran him over. Clark had been carrying a lantern, and the story claims that the light kept swinging after he fell. In another version, a conductor goes on the track after having a few too many to drink. He stepped off to check the line, stumbled, and fell across the rails when a train behind him couldn't stop in time, ran him over, and took his head with it.
You. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Nikinagana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Nikinagana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit PayYourRent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
And ever since then, supposedly, people have been reporting lights moving from the south. They look like a train at first, but the train never arrives. And anyone who's walked down the tracks to see what was happening said that the lights disappear. As for those two lights that are reported being seen, well, the brighter one is supposed to be an oncoming train, and the smaller red one, well, that's the lantern that the conductor was carrying. Locals believe that his spirit still walks the yards, swinging the lantern as he searches the tracks. Now, back to our science fair. Back in 1999, two grade 10 students from Carleton Comprehensive High School in Prince Albert, Dustin Armstrong and Ben McClove, decided that they were going to point a camera at the St. Louis light for their science project. The two had spent time at the old rail bed, watched the light, and later said that they'd seen it with their own eyes, even though the light never showed up on their recording. Years later, two grade 12 students from Churchill High School, Shannon Dunn and Alicia Lederhouse, picked up the same phenomenon for their own science fair project. They also had a history with the site. They had gone out there on a road trip with friends, and the light had scared quite a few people in their group. Now Shannon, she was comfortable with calling this paranormal. Alicia wasn't. In an interview with Jill Sturleft from Leader Post, Alicia said that she had always thought it was car headlights, especially because so many stories mentioned red lights. Taillights were her first guess. Alicia's idea matched the objection that's been around Saskatchewan for a very long time. Don McFerrin, an 88-year-old resident of Prince, Alberta, explained it to reporter Darren Beardhard at the Star Phoenix back in October of 2001. He said that the lights disappeared wherever the road dips, then shows up again and angled northwards. You see that with taillights. So, Shannon and Alicia used this as their hypothesis. Alicia's dad worked as a surveyor for a mineral exploration company, and so he helped them order a magnified map of the area around the old rail line. They marked the spot where they had seen the lights on their earlier trip, along with points where it seemed to originate, and drew a straight line between the two. After that, they looked at the road lines that crossed or ran close to it. They picked out several places along those roads where they planned to check whether the lights matched vehicle traffic. So, they had their plan. Shannon, Alicia, and Alicia's father, they make a 3-hour drive south to St. Louis. And once it gets dark, the girls set up at the usual observation spot near the old railway bed. Her father headed to the road location that they had marked on the map. At each stop, he pointed his vehicle towards the observation point and flashed his high beams, checking in with the girls by cell phone. And they confirmed that they did see the lights several times that night, but none of those appearances lined up with what he was doing. So they come up with a new idea. They move on to Highway 2, which is about 8.5 kilometers from the observation area at its highest point. They originally decided not to look at this place because of the distance from the old tracks. The other roads that they tested sat lower than the observation point, while a hilltop section of Section 2 was close in elevation, so they figured, why not try there? Dad goes out there, and he stays out there for about an hour and a half, flashing his lights whenever the girls call and ask him to. He turns around at one point, and they can see his taillights from 8.5 kilometers away. So they considered that a successful replication of the St. Louis lights and wrapped up their fieldwork. Even after their fieldwork, though, the girls still couldn't figure out how the high beam lights reached them from Highway 2 to the observation point. So they asked their physics teacher, and he points them towards diffraction. Diffraction is what happens when light squeezes through a narrow gap or hits an obstacle, causing it to spread out and change shape. On the Virtual Saskatchewan website, they actually describe what's going on as light passing through a small gap, maybe a distant tree that could be on either side of the old track bed, and it spreads out and becomes larger. Headlights that would normally be too small to be noticed show up through diffraction. After everything was said and done, the girls actually won a gold medal at the Canada-wide science fair for the project. But even with this, there's still an argument that the theory might not be correct. Plenty of witnesses are not convinced, and one of them was Rita Furland. She saw the lights move along the old tracks in broad daylight when she was picking raspberries with her mother, and she didn't believe any vehicle light could explain what she saw. Other people have explained the long history of the St. Louis light. Local stories place sightings back in 1920s, before cars were common on the prairie. Some said that the unusual appearance and duration doesn't match anything coming from passing vehicles. Canadian author Shannon Sin filmed the light on New Year's Eve in 2014 and asked viewers whether they saw it looked like a headlight. Most of them agreed it didn't. So remember that reporter I mentioned earlier, Darren Bernhard? Well, he has an article about the ghost lights, and Joanne Christine wrote a book in 1995 called Ghost Stories of Saskatchewan. In both of these, another account comes from Chris McLeod of Prince Albert. He said that when he was 17, he and his friend Justin Thornsteinson made regular trips to St. Lawrence in a Chevrolet Cavalier to see the lights. Their last trip happened on a cold winter night in 1987. Chris told Christensen that one of the unwritten rules was to never park on the track. He did anyways. In fact, he kind of made a habit of it, and this usually led to some small problems with his car. Nothing major, just kind of like the windshield wipers would start on their own, or his headlights would start flickering. Sometimes there would be issues with the ignition. But on this night in question, things kind of escalated. Chris and Justin had only been sitting there for a couple of minutes when the lights showed up. It came in over the old rail bed and moved along the missing tracks, getting brighter as it approached. They watched it for about half a minute before something pulled their attention away from the light. They noticed smoke had started coming up from under the Cavalier's hood. So naturally, they shut off the engine and they jump out. When they lift up the hood, the alternator is on fire. McLeod later wrote that they didn't have anything with them that could deal with an electrical fire, so they decided to get the car onto the highway and blow it out while driving. So they head back to Prince Albert fast, and nothing else happens along the way home, luckily. They bring it to a mechanic, and he looks at the Cavalier and tells them that the alternator looks fine. In fact, he didn't have an explanation for why it ignited in the first place. So, if you're not entirely convinced that what's happening is an optical illusion or car headlights, and you're looking for a more technical angle, there's another idea that people bring up when they talk about strange lights in the woods. It's the will-o'-the-wisp. Different places use different names for it, but it's basically described in the same way. Small lights that show up at night in remote areas, often looking a bit like lanterns or open flames. Travelers see them off in the distance. They try to follow them, and they end up off a main path before the light disappears. Various cultures have their own explanations for these lights. Celtic stories say that the lights come from fairies carrying lanterns. Anglo-Saxon tradition connects the name will-o'-the-wisp and jack-o'-lantern to wandering souls. In the Alaska Panhandle, the Tlingit describe a similar light as campfires that belong to the Tlishka, a figure said to prey on travelers who have lost their way. Naturally, science has put forward a few ideas to explain will-o'-the-wisp. One of the most popular ones is wetlands. Swamps and bogs release flammable gases, and some researchers think that those gases can ignite when they meet oxygen, creating small flickering lights at night. Now, this doesn't cover reports from deserts or other places where those gases aren't presented at the right amount. But it could explain why the car would randomly ignite. Another idea for will-o'-the-wisp is lightning balls. It's described as a floating sphere of light that shows up during a thunderstorm. Another explanation for will-o'-the-wisp is lightning balls. It's described as a floating sphere of light that shows up during thunderstorms. They are considered extremely rare, and they aren't very well understood. But this doesn't explain when these lights show up in the same areas over and over again, like the St. Louis ghost lights. And a final explanation suggests bioluminescence. There are some scientists that think the lights might come from clusters of tiny organisms that produce their own lights. This is something that we see often in the ocean or other large bodies of water. When the animals get disturbed, they create this light. But outside of bodies of water, fireflies and foxfire fungus are the usual explanations. Will-o'-the-wisp, optical illusion, headless train conductor, or stories locals tell simply to keep the legend alive. Regardless, this light keeps showing up. The stories might change a little bit, and the truth, whatever it is, just stays out of reach. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you love this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, be sure to check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.